The ships have been sitting there for weeks, crews trapped, cargo rotting, oil locked behind a wall of Iranian naval power at the narrowest point on Earth. The United States launched a military operation to break that blockade. It lasted less than 48 hours before Trump called it off. Iran celebrated. Trump called it progress. And somewhere in Beijing today, the foreign minister of Iran is sitting across from China's top diplomat. And the outcome of that meeting may matter more than anything happening in Washington. The question no one can answer yet: is this the beginning of a deal or the beginning of something far, far worse? Welcome. If you have been following the Iran crisis, what happened in the last 24 hours is arguably the most consequential and most confusing development since this war began on February 28th. Here is what we are going to cover in the next 28 minutes. First, we are going to walk you through exactly what just happened with Project Freedom, Trump's military mission to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and why it collapsed almost before it started. Second, we are going to explain why China is now the most important player in this entire conflict, more important than Trump, more important than Iran's new supreme leader, and why Beijing may have every incentive to do absolutely nothing. Third, we are going to reveal the single most alarming gap in this entire crisis, a gap between what Washington thinks is happening in these negotiations and what Tehran is actually saying in public, and explain why that gap could be the thing that pushes this over the edge. By the end of this video, you will understand not just what happened today, but where this is realistically going over the next 72 hours. We cover stories like this before anyone else. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss a breaking update. Now let's get into it. On Tuesday evening, President Donald Trump posted to Truth Social. The message was long, convoluted, and deeply revealing. He announced that Project Freedom, the U.S. military operation launched just days earlier to physically escort commercial vessels through Iran's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, was being paused. He framed it as a diplomatic success. He cited, quote, "great progress in talks with Iran." He said the blockade would remain in place, but the military escort mission would stop. He credited Pakistan and other nations for brokering this pause. But the timeline is jarring. Project Freedom was announced on Sunday. It was operational for less than 48 hours. In that window, Iran attacked U.S. ships directly. Iranian state media called the whole operation a humiliation for Washington, and by Tuesday night, it was over. On Wednesday morning, oil markets responded with cautious optimism. Brent crude dropped roughly 8% to around $101 a barrel. U.S. benchmark WTI fell over 9% to around $92. Stock markets in Asia and Europe surged. South Korea's index jumped over 6% in a single session. But here is the uncomfortable truth beneath those numbers. Oil is still above $100. That is not a resolved crisis. That is a brief exhale. Gas prices in the United States have risen 52% since this war began, now averaging $4.54 a gallon, the highest since July 2022. Analysts at ING said it plainly. The prospect of a permanent peace deal remains, in their words, highly uncertain, and oil looks set to remain very volatile. The breaking moment was not a ceasefire. It was not a deal. It was a pause inside a blockade, celebrated by both sides as a victory, which tells you almost everything you need to know about how fragile this situation actually is. To understand why this moment is so dangerous, you have to go back further than last week. You have to go back to February 28, 2026. That morning, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran in an operation the U.S. military called Operation Epic Fury. The stated objectives were to destroy Iran's nuclear weapons program and induce regime change. But the strikes did something no military planner had dared to publicly predict. They killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the man who had ruled Iran with absolute authority for over 3 decades. The strikes followed a pattern of escalation stretching back years. In June 2025, Israel had already conducted a major operation against Iranian nuclear facilities in what became known as the 12-Day War, which ended in a ceasefire on June 24th. But that ceasefire held only temporarily. Diplomatic negotiations on a new nuclear agreement collapsed in February 2026, reportedly because Trump was, in his own words, not thrilled with the proposed terms, even as Iran had reportedly been willing to make significant concessions. Then came February 28th, the full escalation. Iran responded to the February strikes with hundreds of missiles and thousands of drones launched across the Middle East, striking U.S. military bases in multiple Gulf states, hitting Israeli territory, and attacking locations in Arab nations that host American forces. UK bases in Bahrain, Qatar, and Cyprus were struck. Britain's Royal Air Force was deployed in a defensive capacity. And then Iran did something that sent shockwaves through every economy on Earth. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. That 21-mile-wide channel between Iran and Oman is the most critical choke point in global energy. Roughly 20% of all the world's oil passes through it daily. Iran mined it, positioned its naval forces along it, and effectively turned off a fifth of the world's oil supply. A conditional ceasefire was declared on April 8th. But the strait remained closed. And Iran, led now by Khamenei's son, Mojtaba, the new, untested supreme leader, showed no intention of reopening it voluntarily. This crisis has become a geopolitical chess match with more players than most people realize. Donald Trump is the most visible actor, but also the most unpredictable. He has made repeated claims throughout this conflict about imminent victories and peace deals that have not materialized. He demanded Iran's unconditional surrender in early March. He set 3 separate deadlines: March 21st, then March 23rd, then April 7th, none of which produced a deal. Now he is calling a 2-day military operation a success, and its suspension a diplomatic breakthrough. The credibility gap is significant. Mojtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader and son of the man killed in the U.S.-Israeli strikes, is perhaps the most consequential figure most Western audiences know almost nothing about. He has inherited power under the most traumatic circumstances in the Islamic Republic's history. He is surrounded by hardliners who see any concession as surrender. His room to compromise is severely constrained by internal politics and by the fact that compromising with the country that killed his father carries an obvious psychological weight. Abbas Araghchi, Iran's foreign minister, is the public face of Iranian diplomacy. Today, he is in Beijing. That visit is not ceremonial. It is strategic. Iran needs China's backing, economically and diplomatically. And China is Iran's most powerful protector at the UN Security Council. Pakistan's Prime Minister, Shehbaz Sharif, has emerged as the quiet but crucial mediator in these talks. Pakistan is Muslim, geographically proximate, non-Western, and has relationships with both sides. When Trump cited the request of Pakistan in his Project Freedom Pause announcement, that was a signal. Pakistan's back-channel diplomacy is the only thread holding these negotiations together. And then there is Xi Jinping. He meets Trump in Beijing next week. Iran's foreign minister is in Beijing today. That sequencing is not a coincidence. But here is the part no one is talking about. China is not just a spectator in this crisis. China is the referee. And right now, China may have decided that letting this game go into overtime serves its interests more than blowing the final whistle. If you are finding this valuable, subscribe. We are just getting to the most important part. While diplomats trade statements and markets swing on tweets, the reality on the ground is a human catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. In the Strait of Hormuz itself, cargo vessels and their crews remain stranded. Shipping companies and operators, even after Trump announced Project Freedom, expressed deep caution about actually transiting the waterway. One industry source put it simply, unless both sides consistently allow safe passage over time, the risk profile for ships and their crews remains unchanged. In other words, no ship captain is going to bet their crew's lives on a 48-hour American military mission that has already been paused. Early Wednesday local time, a cargo vessel was struck by an unknown projectile in the Strait of Hormuz. The UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre confirmed the hit through a verified source. The crew status and environmental damage were unknown at the time of reporting. No party immediately claimed responsibility. Inside Iran, the human cost of the February strikes has been staggering. Thousands of Iranians have been killed. Millions have been displaced. Military and nuclear infrastructure across the country was severely degraded. And yet, critically, the Iranian government has not collapsed. The regime has survived, and its capacity to hold the strait hostage through mines, drones, and naval positioning remains intact. For American consumers, the pain is arriving at the gas pump. The national average has risen 30 cents in a single week. At $4.54 per gallon, Americans are approaching historically painful territory. Chevron CEO warned this week at the Milken Institute that as inventories continue to shrink, the United States will see physical shortages, not just price spikes, beginning in Asia, moving to Europe, and eventually hitting the U.S. itself. For the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, the situation is existential. These nations depend on the strait for their own exports. Iran's strikes on Gulf energy infrastructure have already caused significant damage. These countries are caught between their American security guarantees and their geographic proximity to an Iran that has demonstrated it will strike Arab neighbors when provoked. The world's response to this crisis has been a mix of alarm, opportunism, and paralysis. France's President, Emmanuel Macron, called for the immediate reopening of the strait, saying all parties must lift the blockade without delay and without conditions. Macron has pushed a joint France-UK multinational maritime mission as an alternative framework for securing shipping lanes and said he intends to raise it directly with Trump. He also called Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, urging dialogue. Russia has taken a notably different posture. Moscow welcomed the ceasefire and called for a comprehensive settlement. Earlier in February, Russia had offered to take Iran's enriched uranium as part of any political settlement, a proposal that, if accepted, would give Moscow significant ongoing leverage over Iran's nuclear trajectory. China, as noted, has called for an end to the conflict while reaffirming Iran's right to pursue nuclear energy. That second part matters enormously. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi's statement during Arachi's visit today was diplomatically calibrated to show solidarity with Iran while making gestures toward peace. Beijing is threading a needle. It does not want a regional war that crashes global trade. But it also does not want to hand America a clean victory. At the United Nations, the Security Council has been effectively gridlocked, as it has been throughout this conflict, with Russia and China blocking any binding resolution against Iran. Social media in the Gulf states has been dominated by fear and anger. In Lebanon, where Hezbollah has claimed 18 separate attacks on Israeli forces in a single day, the most since the fragile ceasefire began, communities in the south are bracing for renewed escalation. The Lebanon ceasefire, which was a major achievement of the April negotiations, is visibly deteriorating, and its collapse would be directly linked to the broader U.S.-Iran peace process because Lebanon is explicitly listed as a key sticking point in the negotiations. And now we get to the detail that the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing. There is a one-page document sitting in back-channel negotiations right now. A single page that could end this conflict or trigger its worst phase yet. And the reason no one is talking about it is because what is on that page reveals exactly how far apart the two sides actually are. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what comes next is the part that changes your entire understanding of this situation. Here is what the headline coverage is getting wrong. Trump is presenting the pause of Project Freedom as evidence of diplomatic momentum. Markets are celebrating. Oil prices dropped. Commentators are cautiously optimistic. But look at what Iran is actually saying, not to Western media, not through diplomatic channels, but to its own domestic audience. Iranian parliamentary speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who is also Iran's lead negotiator in these talks, posted on X that while the situation in the Strait was unbearable for America, Iran has not even begun yet. Not yet. Those words, directed at an Iranian domestic audience, are not the language of a side preparing to compromise. Iranian state media described the suspension of Project Freedom as a U.S. failure and posted headlines reading simply, "Trump backs down." Now think about the political dynamics inside Iran. Mojtaba Khamenei, the new Supreme Leader, inherited power from a father killed by American bombs. He is surrounded by Revolutionary Guard commanders, hardline clerics, and nationalist voices who view any concession as a betrayal of martyrs. If he agrees to reopen the strait without significant concessions on nuclear rights, on sanctions, on reconstruction, he risks his own political survival, possibly his physical survival. There is reportedly a one-page framework document being circulated in back-channel talks through Pakistani mediators. It addresses freedom of navigation in the Strait, Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs, reconstruction support, and sanctions relief. According to CNN sources, this document exists. But the distance between the two sides on each of those four issues remains enormous. The hidden story is this: Trump needs a deal quickly because $5 gasoline is a domestic political catastrophe. Iran knows that. And Iran's negotiating posture, defiant public statements, military provocations, a foreign minister in Beijing, suggests Tehran is deliberately running out the clock to extract maximum concessions from a desperate American president. Let's talk about what actually happens if this does not resolve. The Strait of Hormuz carries approximately 21 million barrels of oil per day under normal conditions. That represents roughly 20 to 21% of global oil consumption. It also carries about 20% of global liquefied natural gas trade. Every day the strait remains closed, the global economy loses access to resources that cannot be easily replaced from other sources. The Chevron CEO said it directly. Inventories are shrinking. Physical shortages, not price increases, but actual absence of fuel are coming. They start in Asia. They move to Europe. They reach the United States last because America has domestic production capacity, but they reach the U.S. And when they do, the political consequences are catastrophic. For the global financial system, the continued closure threatens something economists call demand destruction. When prices rise so high that people and businesses simply stop consuming, triggering a contraction. The IEA has already reported that demand for oil is falling at the fastest rate seen outside the COVID pandemic. That is not a healthy sign of conservation. That is an economy choking. For Iran, the stakes are equally severe. Its military infrastructure has been massively degraded. Its economy, already battered by decades of sanctions, is under enormous pressure. But Iran has a long history of absorbing pain that other governments could not survive. The Islamic Republic has endured, and its leaders have concluded, historically, and apparently again now, that showing weakness is more dangerous than showing strength. For the Middle East broadly, Lebanon is the canary in the coal mine. Hezbollah's renewed attacks on Israeli forces, 18 in a single day, signal that the fragile architecture of regional ceasefires is cracking under the pressure of the main U.S.-Iran standoff. If Lebanon collapses back into full conflict, the diplomatic bandwidth to manage the Strait crisis narrows dramatically. Analysts and strategic thinkers have been divided, but several clear positions have emerged. Hassan al-Hassan of the International Institute for Strategic Studies made the China point most clearly. Beijing holds, in his assessment, key leverage over Iran, not just as the largest buyer of Iranian crude, but as one of two nations that shields Tehran at the UN Security Council. But he also offered a warning. China might be tempted to play a constructive role, but in the short term, Beijing has somewhat of an interest in seeing the U.S. sink deeper in the Iranian quagmire. This is not a fringe view. It reflects a rational Chinese strategic calculation. A U.S. bogged down in a Middle East energy war is a U.S. that cannot focus on the South China Sea, on Taiwan, or on containing Chinese economic expansion globally. CNN's international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson, reporting from Islamabad, offered a more hopeful read. Pausing U.S. kinetic activity around the strait could help bring moderate voices within the Iranian regime back to the negotiating table. The logic is sound. Every military action gives hardliners in Tehran ammunition to argue that the U.S. cannot be trusted, that any deal will be violated. A pause in military operations creates space, not certainty, but space, for those in Iran who genuinely want an off-ramp to make their case internally. Political analysts studying the Trump-Iran negotiating dynamic have pointed to a structural problem. Trump has announced so many supposed breakthroughs, set so many deadlines, and made so many claims of imminent victory in this conflict that his credibility as a negotiating partner has been significantly damaged. Iran's government knows this pattern. They have watched it play out repeatedly since February, and they are calibrating their response accordingly, meeting enough to keep talks alive while extracting maximum delay and maximum concessions. The oil market analysis from ING is perhaps the most grounded. Peace remains highly uncertain, and price volatility will continue. That is not pessimism. That is what the data shows. Remember the question we started with. Who is actually winning this standoff? Here is what we now know, and it is more complicated than either side wants you to believe. 3 scenarios grounded in what we actually know. Best case, the Pakistan-mediated back channel produces a framework agreement within 2 weeks. Trump meets Xi in Beijing next week, and China uses that meeting to apply decisive pressure on Iran, offering economic incentives in exchange for agreeing to open the strait. A phased reopening begins. Oil prices fall below $85. The nuclear question is deferred to a longer negotiation process. This is possible, but it requires China to genuinely prioritize regional stability over strategic advantage against the United States. Given Beijing's current posture, that is a significant ask. Likely case. The situation continues to stumble forward in the current pattern. Brief optimism, price drops, a new provocation, renewed escalation, another pause, another breakthrough. The strait remains technically closed, but with occasional limited transits. Oil stays between $90 and $120. Gas prices in the U.S. remain above $4.50 through the summer, creating genuine political pressure on the Trump administration. A deal is not reached in weeks. It takes months. The Lebanon situation gets worse before it gets better. The global economy absorbs the damage, slowly, painfully. Worst case. Iran concludes that the U.S. is sufficiently distracted, divided, and domestically pressured that it can extract concessions that effectively legitimize its nuclear program and regional military posture. Or, and this is the scenario analysts fear most, a miscalculation occurs. A ship is sunk. American sailors are killed. Trump responds with overwhelming force. The conditional ceasefire collapses entirely. Iran activates its remaining proxy networks across the region. And what has been a costly, contained crisis becomes an open regional war with no clear end in sight. The next 72 hours will be defined by what comes out of Beijing and by whether the one-page framework document currently circulating between negotiators becomes the foundation of something real or disappears, as so many frameworks before it have. Here is what we want to know from you. First, do you think China will use its leverage to help end this crisis? Or do you believe Beijing sees more advantage in letting the U.S. struggle? The answer to that question may be the single most important geopolitical decision of this decade. And second, Trump paused Project Freedom and called it a win. Iran called the exact same move a U.S. defeat. Both cannot be right. Which side do you think is reading this situation more accurately, and why? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every one, and the best responses genuinely shape how we cover the next update on this story. This is a community trying to understand the world in real time. Your perspective matters. Here are the three things you must take away from everything we have covered today. 1. The suspension of Project Freedom is not a peace deal. It is a tactical pause inside an ongoing blockade, with oil still above $100 and gas prices in America near record highs. Anyone telling you this crisis is close to resolution is either uninformed or wishful. 2. China is the decisive variable. Iran's foreign minister in Beijing today, Trump heading to Beijing next week. This is not coincidence. Beijing now holds more leverage over the outcome of this crisis than any other actor. And right now, China has not decided to use that leverage constructively. 3. The gap between what Trump is telling Americans and what Iran is telling Iranians about where these negotiations stand is dangerously wide. When two sides in an active military standoff have fundamentally different beliefs about who is winning, the risk of catastrophic miscalculation is at its highest. Watch the Beijing meetings, watch Lebanon, watch the one-page framework. Those are the three pressure points that will define what happens next. This story is not over. In fact, what happens in the next 72 hours could change everything. Subscribe and hit the bell, because when it breaks, we will be the first to cover it. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide. Right now, it is the most important 21 miles on Earth.